Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chaiyya Chats. My name is Ruben Thomas, and I'm very happy to have with us today Reverend Father Sujit Thomas. Sujit Achin is currently serving as the assistant vicar at the St. Thomas Orthodox Church in Unruh, Philadelphia. Achin, thanks for getting on with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Ruben. I'm really excited to be drinking chaya with you.
Same. It's great to be here with you, Achin, and I'm very interested in the topic that we have today,
Yeah.
which is struggles of lay leadership, getting into that. And I think just to start off, Achin, how do you define what lay leadership is, and how do we, especially as a younger generation, go about doing that?
Yeah. Lay leadership, two words, right? Lay leadership. Leadership is easy word. What do we mean by lay? Usually the word lay is referring to people who are not ordained, right? So in the church, we have ordained ministers of bishops, deacons, and priests. And what about everybody else? And what role do they have? So the faithful who are not ordained have a role in the life of the church. In fact, we know that they serve and they lead the church in very important ways. If you look at our local parishes and dioceses and all the whole church as a whole, the leadership of the faithful is and the service that they provide is essential. So in the local parish, in the spiritual organizations like MGOCSM, Focus, Sunday school, and in the structure of the church, the faithful can have a service, a role. And so it is about the believer's service to the church and to the world as a whole, right? And I think primarily for our conversation, we can look at what role can a believer play in the life of the church, right? And when we think about that role, it has to be a service oriented role, right? So the Bible verse that always comes to my mind is where Jesus says to serve and not to be served. When Barnabas Trimini came to America, he chose that as the motto for the what was the former American diocese and still remains as the motto for the Northeast diocese. So because leadership is always servant leadership, it's modeled on the leadership of Jesus Christ, who showed us what it means to be a servant. And all of us share in that servant leadership. And so all faithful have a role in that. And the people who are listening to us, college students especially, is a good time in college is to learn it, what it means to be a servant leader.
And I think that gets into the next point of how leadership, lay leadership, is really to serve the church. But is that something that we should be doing of serving? Like, why do we have to serve the church and
Yeah,
not simply come to church and then leave?
yeah, that's a great point because in all things, we would benefit a lot if we always ask the question, why? Such a simple question that even children ask, why? And I think as we become adults and as college students, we should ask, well, why should I serve? Well, because it is a response to the gift of salvation, right? Christ has redeemed you, saved you, and he has brought you to a new identity. So that new identity involves a certain amount of response, and how I live the new identity as a baptized Christian, as a born again believer in the risen Lord, is one to serve as a part of that identity, how I live that identity out, and also as a thanksgiving to Christ for the gift that he has given to me so that I can, in one small way, help and bring others to experience the same salvation that I have come to experience. Because we have been served ourselves, right? We have been enlightened, and that was due to the service of other people in our lives, and we want to serve that similar role in helping others to come to the light of Christ as well. And we also know that when we serve, we grow ourselves. We continue to grow in our salvation. So we serve as a response, as part of our identity, and also so that we might be edified by that service itself.
And then to that point of why we serve, I think sometimes we may have in our minds that there are only a few positions there in the church where we can serve the church, and that if we don't get it, then there's really nothing for us to do.
How and where to serve is something simple, I think. And sometimes we have to make sure that we do not adopt the ways of the world, which are focused on titles, positions, and things like that, right? And so we have to remember one of the sayings of Mother Teresa, that we can all do small things with great love. And one of the things that I always try to look at, and I grew up through MGOCSM. I began to serve in the church through MGOCSM. And one of the things that I look at even in my own home parish and even in experience is who stays back to fold the chairs? Who comes early to set things up? It's the simple things there is no title attached to it, but it is the small things that are being done with great love. We have to remember that we can serve regardless of how old you are, you can serve. And we can serve in different age levels. We can serve, in MGOCSM in as either through the positions that exist through the organization or even outside of that and we can serve in focus. And as college students, we can try to serve through our campus ministries, either through MGOCSM or if you find yourself in a campus where there is an Orthodox Christian Fellowship or an OCF, maybe participate in that. In my own undergraduate years, that my involvement in OCF was really very instrumental in helping me to understand what the Orthodox faith is. And many people serve as Sunday school teachers. And also it's really about, thinking about even the simple ways in which we can serve. God is small things, right? The small things that we can do. And, something as simple as even inviting somebody that you see who has stopped coming to MGOCSM events, inviting them and saying, hey, look, I've noticed that you're not coming as much. I know you might be busy, but hey, there's this event going on this day, and I think you would really like it. Why don't you come? We don't know why they've kind of begun to fall away from the activities. And perhaps this invitation is the one thing that they need to make them come. And remember what I said, we serve not from a position of superiority, but as a fellow person on the pilgrimage, on the journey together with the others who we are trying to serve, right? So we see that my younger brother who is in high school is on the same journey that I am. And I remember my own situation from when he was there as well.
And I think that's a good point that you brought up about the outreach, because a lot of times we may forget about, the people that we even grew up with and how they may not be as present. And I think, at least from my own experience, like once you hit college, I think you see people either get a little bit more involved in church or just seem to sort of take some steps back from being present, right? So I think that's almost like the biggest thing is just reaching out on your own to your brothers and sisters.
Right. I have been thinking a lot in the past few months about the idea of retention, right? So we've been in America, the Malankara Church has been in America for over 40 years, since the mid 60s to a certain degree, the diocese, and from late 70s, early 80s onwards. And so we've had almost third generation now. And we have to think about retention. Are the people who grow up in the church, who are baptized in our church, are they practicing their faith when they become adults? And do their children practice the faith when they become adults? And I don't worry about this from preserving the institution. I worry about this because I don't want anybody who's baptized to walk away from the faith. And so I think about that from that perspective. And I think that everybody plays a role in that, in being able to notice the people who are wandering away and to give a special attention to them and to try to help them, to bring them back to the fold. And it can be just in simple ways, as I said, just inviting them and reminding them about church and their spiritual life and things like that.
And I'm glad that we're talking about the struggle of retention. And I think that leads into the bigger topic of this podcast, which is the struggles of lay leadership. So, Achin, from your experience and from your own ministry, what are some of those struggles that you see when it comes to lay leadership?
Yeah, so especially for young people, there's a lot of struggles that I think when young people, high school and college, and just in that early adulthood 20s, they struggle with, and all the struggles are really part of the larger spiritual warfare, right? There is a battle between good and evil, and the battle that we individually experience is for our own souls, our own lives. And so there's always going to be negative experiences, negative forces that try to keep us away from God, keep us away from Christ, to walk away from the gift of salvation that we have received. But how does this play out? One of the things that I think happens is we sometimes don't see the results that we would like to see. So, let's say we become the MGOCSM secretary for the parish, and then, we do we work together with the committee to like put together a big event, and we put a nice flyer together, and we, do all the announcements, everything, and then 5 people show up. So, the low attendance is really something that gets us down a little bit. And then another one is that there's a general apathy where some people aren't that interested. So we're so on fire and, lit up for the Lord and lit up for wanting to share the beauty of the Orthodox faith. And the things that we're trying to share, some people are, when we're sharing it, people are sleeping or not paying attention, or in fact, maybe even going opposite, like, causing trouble in the meeting that we're trying to do. So the results is one thing that I think is one of the big struggles. And then I think a simpler struggle is learning how to balance our time and to kind of figure out, okay, what is the best use of my time? Then I think the bigger struggle, that especially as they become more involved in the life of the church, is there's a whole lot of challenges that come when they're trying to serve in the mainstream of the church. Of a parish, the people in the church might see his or her involvement in MGOCSM and think, oh, this looks like a good person to put on the managing committee, and then he or she gets put on the managing committee, and then she has a completely negative experience with that. So these are just generally some of in what I have seen as some of the challenges that some of our young people face.
Going to your results point, right? I think sometimes we have a tendency to view it as a results-driven ministry, whereas only if a certain number of people attend, or the outcome or the support that we expected to come, then it's a success, right? And if we don't reach just the numbers, then it's kind of a failure. And I think sometimes that might turn us off a little bit from thinking we've done any good.
Yeah.
Is if we don't think we've reached enough people. Like you said, like if we see that, then if we see the lack of attendance or lack of participation, that might even drive us to think like, okay, well, this may not have done any good, but also recognizing that we just don't know at the end of the day.
Yes, absolutely. We don't necessarily know what happened. And, the kid who's like, throwing spitballs in the conference might be the one person who is transformed the most or receives the most benefit from the conference that we put together. And then also about attendance, Jesus has set the quorum necessary as a very simple one, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name. So that's the minimum. But then also, I think when we think about this from like the purpose of why we're serving, and also from what Christ expects of his servants, is not necessarily results, but it's faithfulness. There's a very famous story that, one person asked Mother Teresa, Mother, you're at the end of your life and you've come to Calcutta, you've served here for over 40 years, but the number of people who are homeless have only grown since you've come here. So do you count yourself a success? And she said, the Lord doesn't call me to be successful, but to be faithful. And that's there whenever Jesus talks about being a servant, he talks about being faithful in the Lord's vineyard. And in fact, we can sometimes fall into the trap of being overly concerned about the results and maybe patting ourselves on the back with a large attendance, but we weren't necessarily faithful, and even the quality perhaps might not have been as good as it could have been. So we have to shift the focus away from results to be about faithful to the task that we're entrusted with.
And I know you just mentioned briefly the path of someone in MGOCSM potentially being in managing committee later on. I think that sort of gets into the next point here, is that when we try to serve, once we get past MGOCSM, try to serve in the mainstream of the church, and then different struggles there, which can be pretty big sometimes, right? And so what are some of those struggles that you see?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, this is something that I have experienced myself, right? grew up in a church that was a very good church, loving church. And I still cherish some of the great memories of that church. And I got to serve through MGOCSM, and then also eventually in different capacities in the church. And then even as an Achan now, my service while I was serving during MGOCSM is very different than how I have to serve today as an Achan. And then when I look at my peers and my friends who grew up here, who try to enter into the mainstream of the church, not even just managing committee, but just even church in general, the parish life in general. I think one of the things that I've realized is it's helpful to kind of talk about the various demographics within our community. Often we talk about our community here as the Malayali Christian community or whatever, as kind of this one unit, like a monolithic group or something. And sometimes we might even say things like, oh, the parents' generation, the younger generation. Well, I don't necessarily know how young I am anymore, right? So I think one demographic to keep in mind is the immigrant generation, right? So generally there is the first generation of immigrants who came to America as adults, or there are some who came in their childhood who are like, maybe 1.5ers, and then some people who grow up in America, who are born and grow up in America, who are either pure second generation or even their children who are the third generation. So we're at a point where the third generation, the children of the first generation, exist now in our parishes. Some of them are now, getting into college age and even older than that. So that's one. Then the other is the age group itself. Within the second and third generation, it's helpful to think about the various different age groups in there also, right? So for example, in America, we talk about the Gen Xers, the people who were born between 1964 and 1980, and then the millennials, 81 to 96, and then the people who were born 97 and before, the Zoomers. And when I'm in Sunday school, when I'm teaching Sunday school, I realize I'm talking to Zoomers. And then my campus ministries and then the young adult ministries are really a lot of millennials. And my cohort is the Gen Xers. And nuancing the demographic with this kind of understanding helps a little bit to see the experiences of the different groups in the life of our church, right? Let me give you an example of that. I think in general, many of our churches in their practical life, the first generation people tend to find an easier role to fit into the mainstream of the life of the church. Even if they've come just in the last few years, a Gen Xer who grew up in the church might not as easily transition into the mainstream life of the servant leadership of the church in a way that a first generation person might.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make, right? That at least I think it would be safe to say for the majority of our churches that most of the people involved in the mainstream leadership are people who have spent a significant amount of time growing up and living in India versus, those who have grown up and lived here in America. And I'm not saying that one is worse or better than the other, but there is a difference, right? Where we still see that there's not a balance. And I think that sometimes because of the struggles that we see within the leadership, that there is never a balance, achieved for many, many years, right? Because I think the trend that we've seen is more people in that Gen X group or even now in the millennial group tend to stay away from church leadership.
We are very grateful to the incredible hard work that the first generation immigrants, starting from 1965 to today, have done. And they are so dedicated to the life of the church. And they have, there are many people who kind of, live as much in the church as in their own homes. And so the only reason you and I are even having this conversation is because of the hard work that they have done. And so it's not to take anything away from that. It's not to push anybody out of any role either, but it's to ask ourselves, hey, how are we doing in terms of retaining those who grew up who are baptized in our church in America, how do they feel about their role in the life of the church? And can we help them to feel more at home in the life of the church? That's a task on everybody. I think that's a responsibility that all of us have to kind of see as our responsibility. My suggestions to people who are younger, the who are in college or high school now, is to see the experience in the life of the church as, this is my church, right? Not to think of it as my parents' church, right? This is something that a lot of young people, second and third generation, often kind of think of the church as something that is somebody else's, not mine. And so we have to realize, oh, this is my church, and I have a role here. Even I have a role of service even today. And we have to not accept, like when we say, like, oh, I've been hearing for 20 years, oh, you are the future of the church. Like, okay, so when will be the present, right? So we have to think that there's God has a purpose for me in the life of the church. And it's very, in a very real fashion, this is in the parish of the church, the life of the local parish, because that's where we experience this in the most concrete manner, I think.
And I think it's important to also mention why the younger generation may even feel that it's not their church, or that they don't want to be a part of that aspect of church. And I think a big part of it is the church politics that are present, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of personal agendas at play sometimes, and a lot of conflicts between people, and sometimes between Achin and the people, right? Or the people and Achin. And I think sometimes we even see it in our general bodies, where there will be people yelling at each other, insulting each other, and sometimes they're yelling at Achin, and maybe even sometimes Achin is responding.
Yeah.
Right? And
It's I think what you're hitting at is when some of the particular challenges that people face when they try to serve in the mainstream of the parish life, personal agendas, right? So not everybody, there are very few people, but not a lot. There are some people who come trying to further their own agenda, and not the common good of the whole parish community. Then there's also the conflict, right? That's what you're hitting at, is sometimes the parish life involves a lot of conflict, and some amount of personal drama, and then there's also sometimes the difficulty in not being happy with how things are run, right? I mean, I know a parish where the minutes of the managing committee are still kept in Malayalam. I mean, how can you be a secretary if you don't know Malayalam? And not to criticize that, and that's the choice that they've made, and that's fine. But so I think the way that I want to think about it is, especially about conflict, wherever two people come together, there's bound to be some amount of conflict. Even in the marriage life, even in a family life, when two people work together. When we work together, when we are, as for young people, when they work together on a team project, that there could be a certain amount of conflict and disagreement. Some low level of conflict is not only okay, it's probably even welcomed. It's probably a good thing. It's probably good for the dynamic and the growth of the group as a whole. But some amount of conflict is very unhealthy. And not only unhealthy, it can damage the growth of the parish life. It can hurt, and it can, obviously a lot of people, some of the young people who get involved and see that unhealthy level of conflict become turned off by the whole experience. These are, I think, some of the issues that specific issues that we might face when we try to mainstream.
I think that's a big point that a lot of young people unfortunately get exposed to, especially once they're about to leave college and once they're a post grad. You see, like in MGOCSM, I don't think you would see as much of the personal agendas and the behaviors that you see when you're older in the church, right? And I think part of it is that, one is that you don't expect it at all, right? You don't expect people in the church to act that way towards each other in the church whether it's during a general body or whether it's just in a meeting or whatever ministry that they're a part of. There's either one way to view it, I think, is one, looking at it as, wow, I can't believe that this is happening within the church, and how is this even possible? And the other to say that, this is happening to me. And like when we talk about service being helpful on the path towards salvation, right? We almost wonder how does serving in this type of environment actually help us, right? Because I can say for myself personally, being in this role, right, even as a council member for MGOCSM, right, there are still certain politics that you face within the parish, within the area, right? And there are a lot of times where I've had to ask myself, do I really want to stay in this role, right? And I think a lot of people face that point, unfortunately, of do I want to be in this role? Is this good for me spiritually? And if you do get out of it, you kind of stay away from leadership for many, many years.
Yeah. So the response to these the struggles that we mentioned, right? One response is people get jaded, or it eventually ends up in a type of cynicism. And cynicism is very dangerous from a spiritual perspective because it quenches the spirit, and it really turns us even it hurts our spiritual life as a whole. Another one is that as you said, Ruben, we have a difficulty in accepting that this type of struggle is something that is happening in what we think of as a holy institution, as a good and supposed to be a loving institution. And so we have a difficulty in accepting that. And I think that should be okay. We should not accept bad behavior. We should not accept unloving behavior. We should be striving for there to be a gentle community. And that's something we should see. And the question of whether I should continue or not, I think is not something that we can put a simple answer on, but whether I should continue to serve in this capacity or not, whatever the choice you make, and there might be some times when it's appropriate for you to step away from some roles for various reasons, whatever choice you make, you don't stop serving. You might stop serving in a particular position. You might stop serving as a council member, or you might stop serving as the parish secretary, but you don't stop being a servant leader, because that's part of your identity now as a new creation in Christ. That's part of who you are as a believer. So we have to kind of protect that sense of overall service orientation from the negative experiences that we might have in the life of the church.
Those are very great points to remember too. And I understand, like, it can be really hard sometimes to remember that, especially when you're going through those struggles, dealing with the issues within a church. There can be Sundays where you go to church and you just don't feel any peace about what's been going on, right? And I think sometimes that gets back to, right, the church being a place for your salvation, and then when you're at church, it really doesn't feel like it anymore. And I think that's something that people struggle with a lot, especially when they're in these positions. And to that point, what do you think are the best ways to really overcome those feelings and that struggle?
What you said is that, when you go to church, you might not necessarily feel that peace, is something that I understand and have experienced to a certain degree myself, but it saddens me to hear that. It's something that I think we shouldn't accept. We shouldn't accept that as a norm, right? So, but there is no one simple solution or even a perfect plan. And I think that's why it's important that we end by talking about what we addressed in the beginning, which is that there's a spiritual dimension to this. This is part of my growth as a person, as a believer in Christ. And there is a spiritual warfare. And I have to remember that God wants me to grow through whatever I'm doing in the life of the church. And the devil wants me to become jaded, cynical, angry at church, not being able to concentrate during the liturgy. All those things are the negative experiences. So I think we are not social workers. We are believers. Not that there's anything wrong with social work. That's, if you are a believer who is a social worker, great. But I'm saying when we're talking about the service in the life of the church, it's because we feel it as a response, as a calling that Christ has entrusted us with. And so if that's true, we have to rest in the Lord a lot. We have to pray and fast. We have to spend time with the Lord to be renewed from his strength. And one other thing is, I think, we have to think about balance in our life. And especially as college students, we're kind of learning how to balance becoming an adult and balancing our life and things like that. And sometimes I've seen bad extreme where somebody just loses every balance and just only does church stuff, and it becomes a kind of even a small negative experience. And so there's need for boundaries in our lives. Boundaries are important. There's a saying, right? Good fences make good neighbors. So boundaries are very important. And also, maybe we can think about something like tithing our time, right? So tithing, regardless of what you think about the 10% or whatever, the idea is that a percentage of what God has given to us, we give back to him. So maybe we can tithe our time. Maybe we can tithe our resources, our talents, even if we're not necessarily doing some particular position in the life of the church. We could serve the Lord by tithing some of our time. So I think we have to kind of see this as a part of a larger spiritual growth. My quest for the larger spiritual growth and continuing to become more Christ-like in my life. And then I also want to say a point about the spiritual warfare. One of the things that I realized when I continue to serve in committees and everything is that the person who sits in the committee whose behavior makes me the most upset is my own. Now I'm at a point where I know that, okay, other people might get mad and say things that are wrong, but why do I lose my temper? Why does that make me angry? Why does it make me sad? So I realize that, okay, this experience of sitting in this committee, the person who's being purified the most through it, from my perspective, is me. And it ought to be me. And so that's something that, I can no longer sit in a committee and say, hey, uncles are making trouble, when I am the one who loses the temper.
Right.
Yeah? So now I have to focus on my own repentance as a part of that, right? So,
right. And I think it's interesting that we began and ended this talk with spiritual warfare, and I think most people, myself included, probably wouldn't associate lay leadership with spiritual warfare, because even when Christ says we live in the world but we're not of the world. Right. I think we expect in our minds, okay, we're going to have a lot of spiritual warfare with the external things of the world, outside, the secular things. Right. But I don't think we're ever prepared or expect to undergo that same spiritual warfare within the church, within the life of the church. And I think that's kind of a big shock whenever we get exposed to it, too.
Yeah, I understand that, but I think we should realize that the enemy is going to attack the strongest against the fortress. The enemy knows where the fortress is, and the enemy is going to try to attack the fortress the most. So seeing that, of course, it shouldn't surprise us that the place that we find ourselves under the most attack is within the fortress, within the bulwark of the church, right? And I have not quit as a servant. I might have moved away from certain positions and roles, but I still think that the Lord has something for me and he's going to use me for something. So, and I know that about you, Ruben, and I know that about everybody who's listening to me. And, that's what I want to share about this, I think.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up, Achin. I think it's a very important topic and one that we all face, especially as we get older. Through college and then post-college. And I think this is something that most people do face in their churches, unfortunately. But like you said, all of this is part of our path towards salvation, if we can look at it and view it as such. So I do appreciate you, Achin, talking about this topic today.
Well, I thank you for the Chaiyya, and I really thank you for the company, and I thank you for doing this great service. You are continuing to grow as a good servant leader. May God continue to bless you and all the listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, Achin. Thank God. For those of you listening, I hope you all continue to stay safe in what you all are doing. And please stay tuned for another episode of Chaiyya Chats.